On the evening of June 17, 1859, the grand ballroom at Thornfield Estate blazed with candlelight as Virginia's most distinguished families gathered to celebrate what should have been a joyous occasion. Within 12 hours, 7 people would lie dead in that same room, their bodies twisted in agony, their final moments marked by screams that would echo through Henrico County for generations. The deaths would be attributed to tainted shellfish, a tragic accident during an elaborate feast. But the truth was far more deliberate, far more calculated, and rooted in a pain so profound that it transformed a gentle woman into an instrument of vengeance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Clara, a woman whose name appears in no history books, whose suffering was considered unremarkable in an era that built its wealth on human bondage, and whose act of resistance would be buried beneath layers of convenient lies. It's a story about what happens when a mother's love collides with absolute powerlessness, when years of silent endurance finally crack under unbearable weight, and when the invisible hands that prepare a master's food decide that service will become retribution. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It should. Because this isn't just a tale of murder at a plantation ball. It's a window into the darkest chapter of American history, told through the eyes of someone who lived it, someone who had every reason to destroy the world that destroyed her. Henrico County in the summer of 1859 existed in a state of beautiful delusion. The tobacco fields stretched endlessly under merciless Virginia sun, their broad leaves promising another season of extraordinary profit for the families who owned them. The James River wound through the landscape like a silver ribbon, carrying ships laden with goods that would be traded across the Atlantic. Richmond, just miles away, hummed with the energy of a capital city, its streets filled with merchants, politicians, and the constant movement of commerce built entirely on the labor of people who owned nothing, not even themselves. Thornfield Estate sat on 1,200 acres of this profitable soil, a monument to everything the plantation class believed about their own superiority. The main house rose 3 stories high, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon light, its facade designed to communicate permanence, respectability, and unquestionable authority. The windows were tall and numerous, allowing cross breezes to move through rooms filled with furniture imported from Europe, paintings of stern ancestors, and all the refined trappings that wealth could purchase. Behind this architectural declaration of power stood a different world entirely. The slave quarters formed 2 parallel rows of wooden structures, each cabin housing multiple families in conditions that would make modern observers recoil. Between these 2 worlds, the big house and the quarters, lay a carefully maintained distance, both physical and psychological. The white columns faced away from where the actual work happened, where children were born into bondage, where bodies broke under impossible labor, where humanity persisted despite every effort to crush it. Nathaniel Whitfield had inherited Thornfield from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. At 58, he carried himself with the assured confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. He was not considered cruel by the standards of his peers. He did not personally wield the whip, did not engage in the most horrific abuses that some planters inflicted on their enslaved workers. He simply accepted the system as natural, as ordained by God and justified by economics, as something that had always been and would always be. His wife Constance had died 2 years earlier from complications of pneumonia, leaving behind a household that still moved according to her exacting standards. She had been the type of plantation mistress who prided herself on running an orderly home, who believed that enslaved people should be grateful for her occasional small kindnesses, who never examined the fundamental horror of claiming ownership over other souls. Her death had been mourned appropriately, her memory preserved in a portrait that hung in the formal parlor, her absence filled by her daughter Josephine, who was being trained to eventually assume similar responsibilities. The Whitfield children had grown up believing themselves inherently superior to the people who raised them, dressed them, fed them, and attended to their every need. Montgomery, the eldest at 21, possessed his father's business acumen and his grandfather's taste for expansion. He had recently returned from university in Charleston, full of ideas about modernizing their operations and increasing productivity. He was engaged to Victoria Ashmore, daughter of another prominent planting family, a match that would unite two substantial fortunes and considerable political influence. Beauregard, 19 and recently returned from his own schooling, had inherited none of his brother's serious nature. He was handsome in the way of young men who have never known hardship, with easy charm that worked on debutantes at balls but revealed itself as cruelty in the quarters. He had particular habits that the enslaved women knew to fear, patterns of behavior that his father either didn't know about or chose to ignore as the natural privileges of a young master coming into his manhood. Josephine, at 17, occupied the peculiar position of a plantation daughter, raised to be ornamental yet competent, educated enough to manage a household but not to question the system that elevated her. She had been particularly close to her mother and still wore mourning clothes more often than strictly required by etiquette. She spent her days practicing piano, reading approved literature, and learning the complex social calculations that would govern her future as a planter's wife. Uncle Thaddeus, Nathaniel's older brother, maintained a separate residence on the eastern portion of the estate but remained deeply involved in its management. At 62, he represented an even older generation of planters, men who remembered when Virginia's soil had been more productive, when tobacco commanded higher prices, when the entire system seemed more stable. He had never married, dedicating himself entirely to the preservation of the Whitfield legacy and the perpetuation of their way of life. The household ran according to rhythms established over decades. A bell rang before dawn to wake the enslaved workers. Another bell signaled meal times. A different bell announced the master's needs. The entire architecture of the estate was designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining the fiction that this was somehow natural, somehow right, somehow blessed by Providence. Edmund Carlyle, the overseer, enforced these rhythms with systematic violence. At 45, he had spent his entire adult life managing enslaved workers for various plantations, developing a reputation for maintaining discipline through fear. He carried a whip and used it regularly, believing that brutality was the only language that the enslaved understood. He lived in a house between the main residence and the quarters, a physical embodiment of the buffer between the world of white comfort and black suffering. Reverend Hosea Mitchell visited Thornfield every Sunday to lead services for both the white family and the enslaved workers, though of course in separate locations. He preached sermons about obedience, about accepting one's station in life, about heavenly rewards for earthly suffering. He could quote scripture to justify any atrocity, finding biblical precedent for bondage and divine sanction for the separation of races. His presence gave moral cover to a system built on theft and violence, wrapping it in religious language that made masters feel righteous about their dominion. This was the world into which Clara had been born 34 years earlier, delivered by her own mother in one of those wooden cabins, entering existence already claimed as property. She had no memory of freedom, no reference point for what life might be like outside the boundaries of Thornfield Estate. Everything she knew about survival had been learned within this system, every relationship she formed existed under the shadow of possible separation, every moment of joy was borrowed against an uncertain future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Clara's mother had worked in the fields until her death when Clara was 7, her body simply giving out after years of impossible labor. Clara had been brought into the big house at age 8, initially to help in the kitchen, her small hands useful for detailed work that required patience. She had learned cooking from an elderly enslaved woman named Ruth, who had been teaching kitchen skills to young girls for 4 decades, passing down knowledge that had been carried from Africa, blended with techniques learned in bondage, creating something entirely new from the fragments of destroyed cultures. By the time Clara reached adulthood, she had become Thornfield's head cook, responsible for meals that fed both the white family and visiting guests. She had a gift for it, an intuitive understanding of flavors and timing that produced dishes the Whitfields proudly served at their most important gatherings. Her beaten biscuits were legendary. Her smoked ham was requested specifically by visitors. Her preserves won compliments from women who would never acknowledge her as fully human. She had married Elijah when she was 18, one of the few choices she was permitted to make. He worked as a field supervisor, a position that gave him slightly more authority than other enslaved workers but also made him complicit in enforcing the same system that oppressed him. Their marriage had produced 3 children. Grace, now 16, worked as a house servant, learning the same skills her mother possessed. Thomas had died of fever at age 4, buried in the small cemetery beyond the quarters where enslaved families mourned their dead without the rituals or recognition afforded to white deaths. And Samuel, her middle child, her bright-eyed son who had loved stories and possessed a quick mind that frightened the overseers. 3 years ago, when Samuel was 11, Nathaniel Whitfield had sold him to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The sale had been purely economic, a response to debt and a particularly good offer. Samuel's individual humanity, his mother's attachment to him, the destruction this would cause to their family, none of these factors registered as relevant considerations. Property was property. Profit was profit. The system had its own logic that made such cruelties not just acceptable but routine. Clara had not been permitted to say goodbye. She had been working in the kitchen when the sale happened, and by the time she learned of it, Samuel was already gone, shackled in a coffle with other enslaved people being marched south toward fates that Clara could only imagine in her worst nightmares. The cotton plantations of the Deep South were notorious for their brutality, their mortality rates, their absolute disregard for human life. Enslaved workers there were quite literally worked to death, their bodies used up and discarded, replaced by new purchases in a constant cycle of consumption. For 3 years, Clara had lived with this wound. She had no way to contact Samuel, no means of knowing if he was even still alive. The not knowing was its own torture, a constant ache that colored every moment. She would wake in the night imagining him sick, hurt, crying for her. She would work through her days with mechanical efficiency while her mind traveled hundreds of miles south, trying to reach across impossible distance to somehow protect a child she would likely never see again. The grief that came from losing Samuel did not arrive as a sudden storm. It settled over Clara like fog, thick and suffocating, obscuring everything that had once given her life meaning. She continued her work because she had no choice. She rose before dawn to light the fires in the separate kitchen house, her hands moving through familiar tasks while her mind remained trapped in that moment when she had learned her son was gone. She kneaded dough and seasoned meat and stirred pots with the same skill that had always defined her work, but something fundamental had broken inside her. Elijah tried to comfort her in the beginning, but what comfort existed for such a loss? He held her when she wept in the darkness of their cabin, whispered words meant to soothe, reminded her that they still had grace, that they needed to survive for her sake. But Clara could see in his eyes that he carried his own unbearable weight. Samuel had been his son too. The boy who had looked at him with admiration, who had asked endless questions about everything, who had possessed a spark that neither of them could protect. The other enslaved workers at Thornfield understood without needing explanations. Nearly everyone in the quarters had lost someone to sale, to death, to the casual cruelties that defined their existence. They offered what support they could, the small kindnesses that people living under impossible circumstances extend to each other. Ruth, the elderly woman who had taught Clara everything about cooking, would sit with her in the evenings, not saying much, just present in a way that acknowledged the vastness of the pain. Grace watched her mother retreat into this fog of grief and tried to fill the spaces that Clara's absence created. At 16, she had inherited her mother's capability, her attention to detail, her ability to read the moods of the white family and adjust accordingly. She took on more responsibilities in the house, covering for the moments when Clara moved too slowly, when her attention drifted, when the weight of loss made even simple tasks feel insurmountable. But children should not have to parent their parents, and Grace was still a child despite the adult work she performed, despite the adult horrors she witnessed, despite the system that refused to recognize childhood for enslaved people. She needed her mother, and her mother was drowning in an ocean of grief with no shore in sight. It was during this period, roughly a year after Samuel's sale, that something began shifting in Clara. The fog of grief that had paralyzed her started transforming into something sharper, something with edges and purpose. She began noticing things she had previously accepted as unchangeable facts of existence. She observed the casual violence of the overseers with new eyes. She watched the Whitfield sons moving through the house with their easy assumptions of superiority. She saw Josephine learning to manage enslaved workers with the same dismissive efficiency her mother had demonstrated. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Where once Clara had found ways to make peace with her circumstances, had discovered small joys in her work and her family, had built a life within the narrow confines permitted to her, now she found only rage. It was a cold rage, not the hot anger that flares and fades but the kind that settles deep in the bones and begins calculating. She started paying different kinds of attention to the rhythms of the house. She noticed who ate what, who had particular preferences, who avoided certain foods. She observed the schedules of important events, the comings and goings of visitors, the planning that went into the elaborate dinners that the Whitfields hosted to display their wealth and status. She watched how trust was assumed, how the White family never questioned what was placed before them, how they consumed food prepared by hands they claimed to own without ever considering that those hands might harbor intentions beyond obedience. Ruth noticed the change in Clara before anyone else did. The old woman had survived 7 decades under bondage by developing an acute sensitivity to danger, an ability to read subtle shifts in people that might signal trouble. She saw something hardening in Clara's eyes, a resolve forming that made Ruth deeply uneasy. One evening, as they prepared vegetables together in the kitchen house, Ruth spoke quietly. "I see you changing, child. I see something building in you that scares me." Clara's hands never stopped moving, her knife cutting through carrots with precise, even strokes. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. And I understand why. Lord knows I understand why. But understanding and agreeing are different things. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning, it will end badly. For you, for Grace, for all of us. How could it end worse than this?" Clara's voice remained level, almost conversational. "My son is gone. He's working himself to death on some cotton plantation where they don't even see him as human enough to keep alive. Grace will face the same dangers I've faced, the same violations, the same powerlessness. And I'm supposed to just accept this? Keep cooking their meals and making their beds and pretending this is natural? That this is God's plan?" Ruth set down her own knife, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "I've buried 3 husbands, 7 children, and more grandchildren than I can count. I know what this system costs. But I also know what happens to people who resist. I've seen women whipped until they couldn't stand. I've seen men sold south for less than what I see forming in your eyes. Whatever satisfaction you might get from fighting back, it won't be worth what it costs everyone around you. Maybe some costs are worth paying. Not when other people pay them without being asked." The conversation ended there, but Ruth's words echoed in Clara's mind during the following weeks. She thought about Grace, about Elijah, about all the other people in the quarters whose lives might be affected by whatever she chose to do. The system was designed to use their bonds against them, to make love itself a form of control. Any act of resistance risked not just the person acting but everyone connected to them. Yet the rage continued building. Clara found herself lying awake at night, imagining Samuel's current circumstances with horrifying clarity. She pictured him in fields that stretched endlessly, cotton bolls sharp enough to shred hands, sun beating down without mercy, overseers wielding whips against children barely old enough to understand why they were being punished. She imagined him sick with no one to care for him, exhausted beyond measure with no rest permitted, crying for a mother who couldn't come, couldn't save him, couldn't even send word that he was loved and remembered. These night visions were torture, but Clara couldn't stop returning to them. They fed something in her that had been dormant, something that the daily requirements of survival had kept suppressed. She began understanding that she had spent her entire life making accommodations with evil, finding ways to exist within systems designed to destroy her, accepting cruelty as inevitable. The loss of Samuel had shattered whatever psychological mechanisms had made that acceptance possible. During this period of internal transformation, external events at Thornfield continued according to their established patterns. The plantation moved through its seasonal cycles. Spring planting transitioned to summer cultivation. The tobacco plants grew tall in fields worked by people who would never profit from the harvest. The big house maintained its routines of formal dinners, social visits, church services, and all the theatrical performances that allowed the White family to believe they were civilized people engaged in respectable enterprise. Montgomery returned from his time in Charleston full of enthusiasm for agricultural innovation. He had attended lectures about crop rotation, learned about new fertilization techniques, studied the latest theories about maximizing yield per acre. He discussed these ideas with his father over dinners that Clara prepared, talking about enslaved workers as if they were equipment to be optimized rather than people capable of hearing their own dehumanization. Beauregard, meanwhile, had developed an interest in horse breeding, a respectable hobby for a young gentleman that gave him excuses to spend time in the stables and away from his father's scrutinizing presence. But the enslaved women knew to avoid the stables when Beauregard was there, had developed warning systems to alert each other when he was in certain moods, had learned through painful experience that his charm toward white women masked something predatory toward those he had power over. Josephine continued her careful education in becoming a plantation mistress. She worked with Clara on menu planning for upcoming events, learning how to organize a household, how to maintain the delicate balance between frugality and display that defined successful plantation management. She was not intentionally cruel, but her kindness existed entirely within a framework that never questioned the fundamental injustice of owning other human beings. It was Josephine who first mentioned to Clara that the family was planning an elaborate celebration for June. Montgomery would turn 21, officially coming of age and assuming greater responsibilities in managing the estate. Beauregard would shortly after celebrate his own milestone birthday. Their father wanted to mark these occasions with an event that would demonstrate the Whitfield family's continued prominence in Virginia society. "We're thinking June 17th, Josephine explained as she and Clara reviewed supplies in the pantry. "A ball in the evening, but starting with an elaborate dinner for our most important guests. Perhaps 40 people for the meal, then another 100 arriving for dancing afterward. Father wants it to be memorable, something people will talk about for years." Clara nodded, making mental notes about quantities and timing, calculating how many days of preparation would be needed. "That's a considerable undertaking, Miss Josephine. The kitchen will need additional help." "Of course. Take whoever you need from the quarters. Father has already approved the expense." Josephine paused, looking at Clara with what might have been genuine concern. "You've seemed tired lately, Clara. Are you well? Should we have Dr. Hartwell examine you?" The offer was made with apparent kindness, but Clara understood its actual meaning. The White family needed her healthy enough to work. Any concern for her well-being was actually concern for their own convenience. "I'm managing, Miss Josephine. Just getting older, I suppose." "Well, don't work yourself to exhaustion. We depend on you far too much to have you falling ill." Josephine smiled, a gesture meant to convey warmth but that landed as something else entirely. She depended on Clara the way one depends on a tool, valuable for its function but replaceable if broken. After Josephine left, Clara stood alone in the pantry surrounded by stores of food that she had no ownership over despite having helped preserve and organize all of it. She thought about the coming celebration, about Montgomery and Beauregard being honored for the simple accomplishment of surviving to adulthood while her own son had been stolen before reaching such milestones. She thought about 40 wealthy plantation owners gathering to celebrate their continued prosperity, a prosperity built entirely on theft and violence. And she thought about how much trust was required for those wealthy people to consume food prepared by hands they claimed to own. The idea arrived fully formed, as if it had been waiting in some corner of her mind for permission to emerge. A coming-of-age celebration. A carefully prepared feast. Specific targets who had earned their fate through specific cruelties. It would require perfect planning, absolute precision, and a willingness to accept consequences that would be severe. But for the first time since Samuel's sale, Clara felt something other than grief. She felt purpose. She began her research the way she had learned everything else, through patient observation and strategic questioning. Thornfield's gardens included numerous ornamental plants that Constance Whitfield had cultivated before her death. Among them were oleanders, beautiful flowering shrubs that line the walking paths, their pink and white blossoms adding color to the landscape. Clara knew from conversations overheard in the kitchen that oleanders were poisonous if consumed, but she needed to understand exactly how poisonous, what quantities would be required, what symptoms would present. She approached this research carefully, never asking direct questions that might arouse suspicion. She mentioned to Dr. Hartwell during one of his visits that she had heard oleanders were dangerous and wanted to make sure Grace didn't accidentally include them in floral arrangements. The doctor, pleased to demonstrate his knowledge, explained in detail about cardiac glycosides, about how even small amounts could cause severe illness, about symptoms that would appear several hours after consumption. She learned from Ruth, who remembered folk knowledge passed down through generations, that oleander poison could be extracted through careful preparation, that it could be concentrated, that it could be added to food in ways that wouldn't immediately alter taste. Ruth shared this information without understanding why Clara was asking, believing it was simply curiosity about the plants that surrounded them. She observed the patterns of the household staff, noting who would be working during the celebration, who might notice unusual preparations, who could be trusted and who represented potential complications. She studied the planned menu that Josephine had approved, identifying which dishes offered the best opportunities for targeted additions, which foods would mask any subtle changes in flavor. Most importantly, Clara began thinking through consequences. If she proceeded with what she was planning, the aftermath would be swift and brutal. Investigation would occur. Suspicion would fall immediately on the kitchen staff. There would be no escape, no possibility of evading responsibility. Anyone involved would face horrific punishment. This wasn't something that could be done and survived. But survival had different meanings. Clara had been surviving her entire life, finding ways to endure within a system designed to crush her. That kind of survival required constant accommodation with evil, required accepting the unacceptable, required becoming complicit in one's own degradation. Perhaps there were worse things than dying. Perhaps living as she had been living, powerless to protect her own children, forced to serve the people who had destroyed her family, was itself a form of death. She thought about Samuel constantly during this planning period. In her imagination, he had become both motivation and witness to what she contemplated. She pictured telling him someday, if such a thing were possible, that she had not accepted his loss passively, that she had made their oppressors pay a price for their cruelty, that his mother had chosen resistance over submission even knowing the cost. But she also thought about Grace, about Elijah, about all the other enslaved people at Thornfield whose lives might be affected by her choices. The system was designed to use these bonds as chains, to make love itself a prison. Any action she took would ripple outward, potentially destroying people who had no part in her plans, who had not chosen her path of resistance. This moral weight pressed down on Clara as she moved through the early months of 1859, maintaining her normal routines while simultaneously planning something that would shatter those routines permanently. She cooked meals for the Whitfield family with the same skill that had always characterized her work, but now she studied them as she served, observing their casual cruelty, their thoughtless consumption of luxuries purchased with stolen labor, their absolute confidence in their own superiority. Montgomery discussed his engagement to Victoria Ashmore at dinner one evening, explaining to his father how the match would strengthen their position in Virginia society, how Victoria's family connections would prove valuable as political tensions with the North intensified. He spoke about marriage as a business arrangement, never mentioning love or affection, reducing what should be a human bond to calculations of advantage and profit. Beauregard, meanwhile, bragged about a new horse he had acquired, describing its bloodlines and potential value with more enthusiasm than he had ever shown for any human being. When Josephine mentioned that one of the stable hands had been whipped for a minor infraction, Beauregard dismissed it as necessary discipline, claiming that enslaved workers required firm management or they would become lazy and disrespectful. These dinner conversations, which Clara had endured for years without commenting, began feeling like evidence being collected for some future judgment. She listened to them describe their world, their values, their complete absence of conscience, and she catalogued these observations like testimony. These were not innocent people caught in a system beyond their control. They were active participants in evil, people who could choose differently but who found cruelty convenient and profitable. As winter transitioned to spring, Clara's planning became more concrete. She identified exactly which dishes at the coming-of-age celebration would serve her purposes. She determined the timing required for symptoms to appear hours after the meal rather than immediately during it. She calculated quantities based on what Dr. Hartwell had explained about oleander toxicity, refining her understanding through careful observation of the plants in the garden. She also began preparing Grace, though without explaining why. She taught her daughter everything she knew about managing the kitchen, passing down techniques and knowledge with an urgency that Grace found puzzling but didn't question. Clara made sure Grace understood the household's routines, the preferences of the White family, the skills needed to maintain her position. She was preparing her daughter for a world where Clara might not be present to guide her. Elijah noticed a change in his wife, the way she seemed both more focused and more distant. He tried to reach her through conversation, through physical affection, through the bonds that had sustained their marriage for 16 years. But Clara had gone somewhere he couldn't follow, had crossed some internal boundary that separated her from normal life. When he asked directly if something was wrong, she deflected with practiced ease, blaming her mood on lingering grief over Samuel. Ruth, however, was not so easily fooled. The old woman had survived 7 decades by reading people accurately, by understanding when danger was approaching. She watched Clara with increasing concern during the spring months, seeing purpose where there should be resignation, seeing calculation where there should be acceptance. She tried several times to initiate conversations that might reveal what Clara was planning, but Clara had become expert at evasion. In early May, roughly 6 weeks before the planned celebration, Dinah approached Clara in the kitchen house during a rare moment when they were alone. Dinah was 29, the daughter of a previous overseer and an enslaved woman, her mixed heritage giving her a complicated position within the plantation hierarchy. She worked as personal maid to Josephine, her proximity to the White family creating both privileges and vulnerabilities. "I know you're planning something," Dinah said without preamble, her voice low. "I can see it in how you move, how you watch them, how you've changed since Samuel was sold." Clara's hands never stopped their work, her knife moving through vegetables with steady rhythm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. And I want to help." This was dangerous territory, involving another person and plans that could destroy them both. Clara measured her response carefully. "Why would you think I need help with anything?" Dinah stepped closer, her own hands trembling slightly despite her controlled voice. "Because Beauregard has been visiting my cabin at night for 3 months. Because when I told Josephine, thinking she might intervene, she told me to be grateful for his attention and to remember my place. Because I have my own reasons for wanting them to pay for what they've done." The revelation hung between them in the warm kitchen air. Clara understood immediately what Dinah was saying, the violations she had endured, the complicity of the White women who knew and did nothing. She also understood the risk Dinah was taking by making this confession, the vulnerability of speaking such truths aloud. "If someone were planning something dangerous," Clara said carefully, still not admitting anything directly, "involving another person would only increase the risk of discovery and punishment. It would be foolish. Maybe. Or maybe 2 people working together could achieve something that one person alone couldn't. Maybe the planning could be better, more thorough, more likely to succeed." Dinah paused, then added quietly, "I'm not asking to be protected from consequences. I'm asking to be part of them." Clara stopped her work finally, turning to look directly at Dinah for the first time during this conversation. She saw in the younger woman's eyes something familiar, the same cold rage that had been building in herself, the same willingness to trade survival for vengeance. It was like looking in a mirror that reflected both past and future. "The coming-of-age celebration," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "June 17th. I need to know everyone's schedules, every detail of the planning, everything about who will be present and when." Dinah nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for explicit statements. "Josephine has been working on seating arrangements. I can make sure you know exactly who will be sitting where, who has dietary restrictions, who is particularly important to the family." Can you access the wine cellar? Yes. Josephine sends me there regularly to select bottles for dinner. And you understand what this conversation means? What will happen if we proceed? Dinah's expression hardened into something that was neither smile nor grimace but contained elements of both. I understand that I would rather die fighting than keep living like this. I understand that they deserve what's coming to them. And I understand that if we're going to do this, we need to be perfect in our planning. Clara studied her for a long moment, weighing risks against possibilities, measuring Dinah's resolve against the magnitude of what they were contemplating. Finally, she nodded. Then we plan carefully. We involve no one else. We accept that there's no survival after this, only whatever satisfaction comes from making them pay. Agreed. They stood together in the kitchen house that had been the center of Clara's working life for 26 years, surrounded by the tools and ingredients of meal preparation, planning how to transform nourishment into destruction, how to turn the most basic act of service into the most profound act of resistance. Outside, spring rain had begun falling, washing across the gardens where oleanders bloomed with their beautiful, poisonous flowers. The conspiracy had begun. Two women whose lives had been stolen and violated and destroyed by the same system, who had reached the same conclusion through different paths of suffering, who had decided that some prices were worth paying if it meant their oppressors would finally face consequences. They would have 6 weeks to plan, to prepare, to ensure that when June 17th arrived, the Whitfield family's coming-of-age celebration would indeed be memorable in exactly the way they intended. The 6 weeks between that whispered conversation in the kitchen house and the planned celebration passed with excruciating slowness for Clara and Dinah, yet also with terrifying speed. Time became elastic, stretching during the long days when they maintained their normal routines while secretly planning something that could never be undone, then contracting during their rare stolen moments when they could speak freely about what they intended to do. They met in the root cellar beneath the kitchen house, a space that remained cool even during Virginia's brutal summer heat. The cellar was Clara's domain, where she stored vegetables and preserved foods, where she kept ingredients that required darkness and steady temperature. It was also the one place where they could talk without being overheard, where the thick earth walls absorbed their whispered conspiracies, where they could transform rage into strategy. Dinah brought intelligence from the big house that proved invaluable. She had access to Josephine's planning documents, the seating charts and guest lists and detailed schedules that governed events of this magnitude. She copied information carefully, memorizing details that she would relay to Clara during their cellar meetings, building a comprehensive picture of how the celebration would unfold. The guest list included Virginia's most prominent planting families, men who controlled vast acreages and hundreds of enslaved people, women who prided themselves on managing households built on stolen labor. Judge Cornelius Brennan would attend with his wife and their 2 adult children. The Ashmore family, including Victoria who was engaged to Montgomery, had confirmed their attendance. Uncle Thaddeus would naturally be present, along with several of his close associates from neighboring counties. Dr. Silas Hartwell would come with his family, bringing his medical expertise to what was intended as a celebration but would become something very different. Reverend Mitchell had been invited to deliver a blessing before the meal, to thank Providence for the Whitfield family's continued prosperity, to offer spiritual sanction to an event celebrating young men who had built nothing themselves but inherited everything from generations of theft. His presence particularly enraged Clara, who had endured years of his sermons about obedience and accepting one's divinely ordained station. He would learn too late that his God might have other plans than the ones he preached. The dinner would seat 40 guests in the grand ballroom, which had been cleared of its usual furniture to accommodate long tables arranged in a U-shape. The honored positions at the head table would be reserved for the Whitfield family, their closest relatives, and the most important guests. Montgomery would sit beside Victoria, displaying their engagement to the assembled company. Beauregard would be positioned near several young women whose families held substantial property, potential matches that might further expand Whitfield influence. Dinah reported that Josephine had organized the seating with meticulous attention to social hierarchy, ensuring that every guest was positioned according to their importance in relationship to the family. This careful arrangement would prove useful for Clara's purposes, allowing her to identify exactly who would be consuming which dishes, who represented primary targets and who might be unfortunate casualties of proximity. The menu that Josephine had approved was elaborate even by Plantation standards. It would begin with oyster soup, followed by stuffed quail, then a course of baked ham with various accompaniments, a palate-cleansing sorbet, roasted venison, multiple vegetable dishes, fresh breads, and finally an array of desserts including pound cake, fruit tarts, and syllabub. The wines had been selected to complement each course, bottles brought up from the cellar where they had been aging, representing both the family's wealth and their refined tastes. Clara studied this menu with the focus of a military strategist examining battlefield terrain. Each dish represented a potential vector for what she planned, but also presented specific challenges. The oyster soup would be served from a communal terrain, making it difficult to target specific individuals. The quail would be plated individually in the kitchen, offering better control but requiring more complex coordination. The ham would be carved at table, reducing opportunities for selective additions. After days of analysis, Clara and Dinah determined that the venison course offered their best opportunity. The meat would be roasted whole in the kitchen house, then carved into portions that could be selectively treated before plating. The rich, gamey flavor of venison would help mask any subtle changes in taste. The timing of the course, appearing late in the meal after guests had consumed considerable wine, would mean that symptoms might not appear until the dinner had concluded and people had separated, complicating any immediate investigation. But they needed to be selective about targets. Clara had no desire to kill indiscriminately, to harm people whose only crime was accepting dinner invitations. She wanted Montgomery and Beauregard to face consequences for their specific cruelties. She wanted Nathaniel Whitfield to understand what it meant to lose children he loved. She wanted to strike at the heart of this family that had destroyed hers. This required precision that went beyond simply poisoning a dish that everyone would consume. It meant identifying which specific plates would go to which specific people, maintaining that identification through the chaos of dinner service, ensuring that the correct portions reached the correct targets. It was a problem of logistics as much as chemistry, requiring perfect coordination between Clara in the kitchen and Dinah serving in the ballroom. They developed a system of marks, subtle scratches on the underside of certain plates that would be invisible to guests but identifiable to Dinah. 3 scratches would indicate the highest concentration of oleander extract, portions intended for Montgomery and Beauregard. 2 scratches would mark plates for Nathaniel and Uncle Thaddeus. Single scratches would identify portions for guests whose presence represented active participation in maintaining the system that oppressed them, judges who enforced fugitive slave laws, merchants who trafficked in human beings, overseers who wielded whips. The plates without marks would contain venison that had been prepared normally, allowing some guests to survive and bear witness to what had happened. Clara wanted survivors who could tell the story, who could carry into the future some understanding that enslaved people were not passive victims but human beings capable of striking back against their oppressors. The extraction of poison from oleander plants proved less difficult than Clara had anticipated. The process required patience and care but no special equipment beyond what already existed in the kitchen. She harvested leaves and flowers from plants in the garden during early morning hours when no one was watching, taking only small amounts from each bush so that the overall appearance wouldn't change noticeably. She brought these cuttings to the root cellar where she could work undisturbed. Ruth's remembered knowledge proved essential. The old woman had shared, without understanding why Clara was asking, that oleander poison could be concentrated through careful boiling and reduction, that the resulting liquid could be stored in sealed containers, that even small amounts retained their potency. Clara followed these instructions with the precision she brought to all her cooking, treating the poison extraction as simply another recipe to be executed perfectly. She tested the resulting extract on rats that inhabited the areas around the kitchen, observing how quickly symptoms appeared, how the creatures died, calculating dosages based on weight and consumption. It was grim work that required her to watch living things suffer and die by her hand, a preview of what she intended to inflict on human beings. She forced herself to witness these deaths without flinching, steeling herself for what was coming. Dinah, meanwhile, worked on her own preparations. She cultivated an even deeper relationship with Josephine, becoming indispensable in the planning of the celebration, ensuring that she would be centrally involved in the service during the actual dinner. She volunteered to oversee the wine service, a task that would give her reasons to move around the ballroom, to approach specific guests, to maintain awareness of who was consuming what. She also began taking items from her cabin, small personal possessions that she moved gradually to a hiding place beyond the quarters. If they somehow survived what they were planning, if the impossible happened and they managed to escape, she wanted to have resources available. But this was more symbolic gesture than practical preparation. They both understood that survival was unlikely, that what they were planning would almost certainly end in their deaths. As June approached, the entire plantation shifted its focus toward the coming celebration. Additional enslaved workers were brought in from the fields to help with preparations. The big house was cleaned until every surface gleamed. The gardens were manicured to perfection. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers were taken down, washed, and rehung so they would sparkle properly during the evening festivities. New linens were ordered for the tables. Silver was polished until it reflected like mirrors. Clara requested and received permission to bring in 3 additional women from the quarters to help with food preparation. She chose carefully, selecting people who were competent but not observant, capable of following instructions but unlikely to notice if Clara did something unusual during the chaos of preparing for 40 guests. She assigned them tasks that would keep them occupied and away from her own work on the venison. Grace noticed her mother's increasing tension as the date approached. The girl had been watching Clara carefully for months, sensing that something significant was building but unable to identify exactly what. She tried several times to initiate conversations about what was troubling her mother, but Clara deflected these attempts with practiced ease, claiming she was simply feeling the pressure of such an important event. One evening, about a week before the celebration, Grace caught Clara alone in the kitchen house after the day's work had finished. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold that seemed to mock the darkness of Clara's intentions. "Mama, I know something's wrong. I've known for months. Please talk to me." Clara looked at her daughter, this girl who had inherited her capability and her strength, who represented both everything Clara had to lose and everything she was fighting for. She wanted to tell Grace the truth, to explain why what she was planning mattered, to make her daughter understand that some acts of resistance justified their costs. But involving Grace meant endangering her, potentially marking her as complicit in what was coming. "You're imagining things, child. I'm just tired and worried about getting everything perfect for the celebration. You're lying to me. You never used to lie to me." The accusation hung between them, sharp and accurate. Clara had indeed been lying, by omission if not commission, hiding her intentions from the person she loved most because love itself demanded that protection. She reached out and took Grace's hands, feeling how much they had grown, how capable they had become. Some things are better not known. Some burdens shouldn't be shared. When you're older, you'll understand that protecting the people you love sometimes means keeping secrets from them. "I'm not a child anymore, Mama. I work like an adult. I'm treated like an adult by them." Grace gestured vaguely toward the big house. "I deserve to be trusted like an adult by you." Clara pulled her daughter into an embrace, holding her tightly, memorizing the feel of her, the smell of her hair, the realness of her presence. She had already lost Samuel to forces beyond her control. What she was planning might result in losing Grace as well, though in a different way. If Clara was executed for poisoning the Whitfield family, Grace would be left alone, marked as the daughter of a murderer, facing a future even more uncertain than the present. "I love you more than anything in this world. I need you to remember that, no matter what happens. Everything I've ever done has been because I love you and your brother, because I want something better for you than what I've had." Grace pulled back slightly, studying her mother's face with eyes that had learned to read expressions, to understand what wasn't being said. "You're scaring me, Mama. You sound like you're saying goodbye." "I'm not saying goodbye. I'm just saying I love you. Is that not allowed?" But Grace wasn't fooled, even if she couldn't identify the specific danger she sensed approaching. She left the kitchen house troubled, looking back several times at her mother who stood silhouetted against the fading light, looking like someone preparing for battle rather than someone preparing a celebration dinner. Elijah also grew more concerned as the date approached. His wife had been distant for months, retreating into some internal space where he couldn't follow, but now she seemed almost feverish with focus, consumed by preparations that went beyond what even such an important event should require. He tried to reach her through their normal intimacies, but Clara had become someone else, someone he recognized but didn't fully know. The night before the celebration, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay beside Elijah in their cabin, listening to his breathing, aware that this might be the last night they spent together. Tomorrow would change everything, would set in motion events that could not be stopped once begun, would transform her from enslaved cook into murderer, from victim into agent of vengeance. She thought about Samuel, trying to imagine where he was at this exact moment, whether he was sleeping or working or suffering in ways she couldn't prevent. She thought about the justice she was planning, whether it was truly justice or simply revenge dressed in more respectable language. She thought about the people who would die tomorrow, who would consume food she prepared and trust that it was safe, who would never imagine that the hands that cooked for them might harbor murderous intent. Some of those people deserved what was coming. Montgomery and Beauregard had earned their fates through specific cruelties, through choices they made daily to uphold and benefit from a system built on violence. Nathaniel Whitfield had sold her son like property, had destroyed her family for profit, had lived his entire life extracting value from people he claimed to own. These deaths she could justify, could frame as righteous rather than simply murderous. But others who would die tomorrow were less directly culpable, or at least their crimes were more diffuse. Judge Brennan enforced laws that kept enslaved people in bondage, but he did so believing he was upholding order and civilization. Uncle Thaddeus perpetuated the system but had also shown occasional small kindnesses that, while insufficient to redeem him, complicated the simple narrative of evil deserving punishment. Some guests would die simply for being present, for accepting dinner invitations, for participating in a society that normalized atrocity. Clara wrestled with these moral complexities during the dark hours before dawn, knowing that once she proceeded there would be no opportunity for nuance, no way to ensure that only the most deserving faced consequences. Poison was indiscriminate in some ways, unable to measure relative guilt, incapable of distinguishing between those who actively created suffering and those who simply benefited from it passively. But ultimately, Clara decided that perfect justice was impossible in an imperfect world. The system itself was indiscriminate, destroying people regardless of their individual innocence or capability or humanity. Children were born into bondage because their mothers were enslaved, inheriting oppression like property. Families were separated based on economic convenience rather than any moral calculus. People died in fields or under whips without consideration of their specific worthiness to survive. If the system showed no mercy, demanded no precision in distributing suffering, then perhaps resistance need not be perfectly calibrated either. Perhaps it was enough to strike back in whatever way was possible, to make the comfortable uncomfortable, to remind the powerful that their power had limits, that even the most oppressed people retain the capacity to fight. As dawn approached, Clara rose and began preparing for what she knew would be her last day of normal work. She dressed carefully, braided her hair with the same precision she brought to all tasks, looked one final time at Elijah sleeping peacefully, unaware that his wife had become someone capable of multiple murders. She walked through the early morning darkness to the kitchen house, where she would spend the day transforming ingredients into a feast that would kill. The root cellar held the extracted oleander poison, sealed in a small jar that looked innocent amon. The preserved foods and stored vegetables. Clara retrieved it carefully, holding this distilled vengeance in her hands, feeling its weight both physical and moral. Today she would add it to food she prepared with the same skill that had always characterized her cooking. Today she would serve death to people who had been served by her their entire lives. Today she would discover whether resistance mattered more than survival, whether striking back justified any cost. The kitchen house began filling with activity as other workers arrived. The 3 additional women Clara had requested came ready to follow instructions, to help prepare the elaborate meal that would feed 40 guests. They moved through their assigned tasks efficiently, chopping vegetables, preparing sauces, kneading dough for fresh bread. They had no idea that the woman directing their work was planning multiple murders, that today's celebration would become tomorrow's tragedy, that they were participating in something that would echo through Virginia's history in whispered stories about resistance and revenge. Clara watched them work, these women who trusted her, who followed her instructions because she had earned respect through years of competent service. If her plan succeeded, their lives would also be affected, though in ways impossible to predict. The investigation that followed would scrutinize everyone involved in food preparation. Some might face suspicion, might suffer consequences for being present even if they had no knowledge of what Clara intended. The system would demand scapegoats beyond just those directly responsible. But there was no path forward that didn't risk others. The entire architecture of resistance was built on impossible choices, on deciding that some goals justified collateral damage, on accepting that fighting back meant potentially harming people who didn't deserve harm. Clara had made her peace with this moral weight, or at least had decided that bearing it was preferable to continuing her passive acceptance of injustice. Dinah arrived mid-morning with instructions from Josephine about final details for the table settings. She caught Clara's eye briefly, a moment of silent communication passing between them. Tonight they would execute the plan they had developed over 6 weeks of careful preparation. Tonight they would discover whether their calculations were correct, whether their courage would hold, whether resistance would bring the satisfaction they imagined or only compound their suffering with guilt. The venison had been delivered the previous day, a magnificent buck that would provide enough meat for the entire dinner party. It hung in the cool storage area, waiting to be prepared, innocent of its role in delivering death. Clara studied it with the eye of someone who had butchered countless animals over her years in the kitchen, planning her cuts, identifying which portions would serve which purposes, treating it as both food and weapon. As the afternoon progressed, Clara began the actual poisoning with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. She worked in the root cellar where she could be alone, where the specific portions of venison destined for marked plates could be treated with the oleander extract. She used a brush to apply the poison, coating the meat carefully, ensuring even distribution that would make detection through taste nearly impossible once the venison was cooked and served with its accompanying sauce. The portions for Montgomery, Beauregard, Nathaniel, and Uncle Thaddeus received the highest concentrations, enough to ensure death rather than merely illness. Other marked portions received smaller amounts, calibrated to cause severe symptoms but potentially survivable depending on individual constitution and how much each person consumed. The unmarked portions remained pure, prepared with the same care Clara brought to all her cooking but without the additions that would transform dinner into massacre. She finished this work as afternoon transitioned toward evening, the kitchen house becoming increasingly chaotic as the dinner hour approached. Guests would begin arriving at 7, gathering for drinks and conversation before being called to table at 8. Clara had roughly 4 hours to complete all preparations, to ensure that every dish was ready at the proper time, to maintain the appearance of normal celebration while secretly orchestrating something terrible and necessary and irreversible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.